Hello. I thought I would cover some fundamentals about music. We'll talk about the scale today. We'll talk about a thing called intervals. We'll talk about how intervals affect the scale, how intervals affect chords, and then we'll talk about chord progressions and how intervals affect chord progressions. So I've got my notes here, just in case I forget something important. I'm going to be checking periodically to make sure I haven't left out anything that I wanted to say. So let's get started right now. Let's talk about the scale, and we'll talk about the major scale, and we'll start with the C major scale. Now, the C major scale sounds like this. And what that is a series of notes that starts on what we call the root, which is the C. In a C scale, the root will be a C. In a G scale, the root will be a G. So it's the note that has the same name as the chord itself. So let's start over here for illustration purposes. Here's our C, and we'll call that the root of the C scale. The next note is a whole step up, and on the guitar, a whole step is skipping a fret. So we go from here to here, and that is a whole step. Obviously in between, that would be a half step. But we're going to go from C to the second note in the scale, which is a D. That is an entire step. Then we're going to go to the third note in the scale, which is an E. Then interestingly, between the third note and the fourth note of the scale, there's only a half a step. So it sounds like this. And then, for the next note, we'll go to a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and a half step. All right, so since we're going from here to here, 1, 2, 3, that interval space between the notes is called a third. And it's called a major third. Now, if we were to go from here to here to here, half step, that would be a minor third. So a major scale is composed of a 1, 2, 3, that is a major third, half tone, whole tone, whole tone, whole tone, half tone. All right. Let's now build a chord. A major chord is built up of the notes that are from the root, a major third, and a minor third. So the notes themselves are C in a C chord, C, E, and G. So from C to D to E, that is a major third interval. From here to the G, that would be a minor third interval. So we're going from here to here, to the second note of the chord, that's called a major third, and then to the third note of the chord, which is a minor third interval. And then we go back to the first note of the chord. Now, if we wanted to turn that into a minor chord, we would switch it around and we would go from here to here, which is a minor third interval, and then from here back to G, which is a major third interval. This is an awkward way to do, but you get the idea. We're taking this note and moving it down here, and this isn't the way we would play a C minor chord normally, but for illustration purposes, you can see that moving that third over here to the minor third changes the tone of the chord entirely. So the concept here is that chords are made up of major and minor third intervals. Let's take, for example, a 7th chord. It turns out that if we play a 1 and a 3 and a 5, we have a G, and we want to make it a 7th chord, the common 7th chord. It's actually a flatted 7th chord. We want to add a minor third interval. So here's our G, A, B flat. So this gives us our common C 7th chord. If we want to build on that, we'll add another minor third interval and we'll get a 9th chord. If we want to build on that, we'll get another minor third interval, and we'll have an 11th chord, another minor third interval, we'll have a 13th chord. If you get past 8, then an 11th is really a 4th, and a 13th is really a 6th. So here's our 13th chord. Now it turns out to be fairly cumbersome on a guitar to play more than 4 notes, 5 notes at a time. On a piano, you have 2 hands. You could easily play all the notes in a 13th chord, and it would sound great. But on a guitar, we're going to leave out some of the notes, and we might play this 13th, and that leaves out some of the other notes of the chord, but our mind fills in the blanks, and we get the idea. So this is a 13th chord. This is a 13th chord. It's got a few more notes in it, but it doesn't have all the notes. Okay. There are just a couple more chords I want to talk about. One is the augmented chord. Now the augmented chord has 3 notes in it, and each note is a major third interval away from the other note. So if we start on C, and we go to the E, then we go from the E to the so we have an A flat there. That comprises an augmented chord. And since every note is equidistant from every other note, any note can be the root. So that chord can be a C augmented, it can be an E augmented, or it can be an A flat augmented. Any one of those will give you the augmented sound. So you may have seen in some chord books this awkward looking, that's your augmented chord. When I'm playing rhythm guitar, I kind of like to put the chord inside, and there's an interesting version of this chord that has, where you press down on these 2 strings and this, and you get that augmented chord, and it sounds very nice, and it can lead into something else. So it's a nice little chord to be able to use, and there's other uses for it as well. But it has an interesting tone, and it's instantly recognizable as being an augmented. Let's talk about one more chord, and that is the diminished chord. The diminished chord is similar to the augmented chord in that it is made up of thirds equidistant. The notes are equidistant from each other, but in this case, instead of major third distances or intervals, we're going to have minor third intervals. So the chord starts out here, let's say. We have a C, and instead of going to the E, we're going to go to the E flat. Then we're going to go here, and the chord sounds like this. And you may recognize that chord. And when I play rhythm, I play a form of that chord that's like this. And it's also an interesting chord because it leads into so it can be, well, we'll get into the other terminology in a minute. But those are your basic chords built up on intervals. And when you get into jazz, you can have raised and lowered fifths, you can have all sorts of interesting chords. Major 7th chords, which is all The intervals are slightly different, but that's the fundamentals. So let's talk about a thing called chord progressions. Chord progressions are used in every song, and it's where you put the chords together in a certain pattern that actually makes up the song itself. So let's talk about the simplest progression. Actually, the simplest progression is 2 chords, but let's talk about a simple progression, the one you've heard in church, a church progression. We go to the 1, and we'll start on C, and we'll call that the 1. And then we go to an F, and then we go to a G. So that sounds like... And there have been endless songs written with that progression. And you can mix it up. And that's your basic chord progression. Now, there are also minor progressions. So, for example, we could have an A minor, where we go to the D minor, and then we go to the E7. Now, interestingly, the A minor chord is only 1 note away from the C chord. And we call the A minor the relative minor of the C. And every major chord has its relative minor. So an F chord would have a D minor as its relative minor. Now, interestingly, if we mix the major and relative minors of a chord progression, we have something that's also very recognizable. So we have, for example, we take the C and we take its relative minor, or the relative minor of the second chord of the progression, and then like this, so we can get... And there have been endless songs created on that chord progression. In fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, we had a thing called doo-wop, and there were hundreds of songs written in a doo-wop format. So you may recognize... Or you may recognize a song that Bobby Darin did, if you're into that. Can't remember, must have been back in the 60s or 70s, Somewhere Beyond the Sea. Beyond the Sea was written by a French person, and it was actually called La Mer. It's a French song, but... So the same thing. So you'll see that progression used in a number of different areas. You'll see a little variation of it used in jazz progressions. But it's very, very common. Now let's introduce another concept, and that is the terminology or the naming concept. So in a basic progression, the first chord of that progression is the 1, the root, the 1, it's the first chord. In the key of C, it will be the C chord. The next chord in that progression is actually the 4th. And the next chord is the 5th. So, if you were in a group and somebody was going to teach you a song, they might say to you, they would give you the key of the song, C, D, or A, or whatever, but then instead of telling you the exact chords, they would assume you knew them just by their numbers. And so they would say, well, first you go to the 1, then you go to the 5, then you go to the 4, or you might go to the 4 and then the 5. You might go to the 2. So if you go from the 1 to the 2, it sounds like this. And then you might go to the 5, and then the 1. So you can see that the numbering process is very, very handy. When you're writing this down, the relative minors are written a little bit differently so you can recognize that they're a minor chord. So for example, they would use Roman numerals. So this would be Roman numeral 1, this would be Roman numeral 4, this would be Roman numeral 5, but the minor would be written in small letters. So the 2 minor would be a D minor. That would be the 2 minor. So you would go from 1 to a 2 minor, or 1 to a 6 minor in small letters, small numerals. So that's how they would distinguish that for you. So if you were playing in a jam, for example, and you wanted to learn a song really quickly, they might describe the song in terms of their Roman numerals, large and small. And they would say you'd go to the 2 minor, you'd go to the 2, or you'd go to the 5, or you'd go to the 4. And it's very handy, and songs are comprised that way. So let's talk about one more concept, and that is how these chords are used maybe in some of the advanced songs. So in your basic song you might use 1, 4, 5, but when you get into some of the more complex songs, maybe some of the standards, some jazz, they actually play with the key of the song, and you might play a few chords, and then you might change keys for a part of the song, maybe part of a measure, part of something, and you might go to a different key for the time being. You'll be in the same key in the on the sheet music, but they might move that entire song up a major third, a minor third, maybe move it down a major third or a minor third. So for example, let's play that song Beyond the Sea. Okay, so you play here for a while, then interestingly it goes up to the A. Then it actually goes up a minor third to the C. And then makes a little transition by going to the C7th, and now you're back to the F. So you can play with the concepts of major and minor thirds, both in structuring the chord and structuring the chord progression. And one last thing, John Coltrane wrote a song called Giant Steps, where he really used major and minor thirds. So inside of a single measure, he moved from the first chord of the measure to the second chord of the measure in a major third. Between the measures, he moved from one measure to the next measure in minor thirds. And then within that measure, a major third between the first chord of the measure and the second chord of the measure. So once you get into the more complex music, that's one of the things you can play with, and that's one of the things that makes the music sound. That's one of the things that makes the music sound interesting. And so you can think about those concepts for a little while. The reason I've covered all of this territory is that eventually, in these instructionals, I'd like to get into some music that might be a little bit more complex, or maybe some concepts that are a little bit more complex, and I'd like to be able to make reference to maybe a 13th chord, maybe a 9th chord. And you'll understand what those are, and they're not that difficult. You just have to find where they are on the guitar and find the best one on the guitar. And on the guitar, we're pretty versatile. We have maybe 3 or 4 different places that we can play a really nice 9th chord or a 7th chord or a 13th chord. And then it becomes an interesting thing of how you put those together and make them sound like a good song. So anyway, hopefully that's a good foundation of harmony for us, and we can move on from there to learn some other songs. So